Now, during my search and trawl through my DMs, I picked up on a few specific questions about building muscle and also just muscle in general. So what I'm going to do in this particular episode of the show is dig into those questions and give you some of those answers. So I've got them written down here and I'm going to go through those right now. Now, the first question came from a quiz, so not necessarily or technically a question, but still worth us delving into. Now, this was about rep ranges and which rep range was the best, quote unquote, for building muscle. Now, again, if you are kind of subscribed to the bro theory, you're probably going to spit out something like 8 to 10 or 10 to 12 if you're a female or something along those lines. Now, the reality is, and the answer to the question is that you can build muscle at any rep range that you select between 4 and 30 repetitions. If you look at the research into hypertrophy, into building muscle, it's probably what it's going to tell you is that you can build muscle in a variety of rep range. Now, the key thing that you've got to underpin the whole lot with is as long as intensity is matched. So that means that, for example, let's say you're taking those 8 to 10 reps, you're taking that to failure. And if you then push to 30 repetitions, you've also got to take that to failure. And you've got to match for training volume across the course of a workout or across a week or whatever time frame that you're measuring across. As long as you account for all those variables, then you can build muscle at any particular rep range. So there is this whole sort of thing that, okay, well, 8 to 10 is best, or is it 4 to 6, or is it this or that? Now, what we do know is that a lower rep range is really going to be for strength. So if you want to build strength, then go for those bottom end rep ranges. Obviously not exclusively, but predominantly you want to be sitting in those bottom end rep ranges. But you have got this real broad rep range if your goal is to just put on a fuck ton of muscle. That's where you want to be at. Now, that's like the theory. And as with so much other stuff, whether it's training and nutrition, there's this whole word of optimal. Optimal this and optimal that. And I'll be the first one to say is I talk about things being optimal as well. Now, the way I use something that's optimal is that's my start point. If that's the way that is the most optimal way to build muscle, lose weight, whatever the goal is for the client that I'm working with, is that's my start point. Now, the way my thought process works is if that's optimal and I've got my client here, what is the least I can take away from optimal to get this to suit the client? And that's kind of where you want to approach it from, is that there's rarely going to be a situation where you're going to be able to plug into what's optimal for training and nutrition, because you're probably not a robot who's got, 24 hours a day to spend thinking about training and nutrition. You've got a life, you've got a work to do, you've got a fucking career, and you've got a family to look after and mortgages to pay and things like that. So it's not necessarily, you're not going to be able to plug straight into, okay, what's optimal, so just fucking go do that. That would be bad coaching in my point of view. I think what you've got to do is say, right, this is optimal, and then what is optimal for this person? And that becomes just saying, well, what is the least amount of I can take away from optimal to make it fit this person? Now, when it comes to rep ranges, often that comes just down to practicality and enjoyment. Now, practicality, I mean by that is that there's rarely many people that can maintain focus, form, and all that other sorts of shit for like 30 reps of squats. It's like, there's not many people that really can fucking, or want to do that, or actually can do that. That's why I generally say, like, movements that you could potentially lift more weight with, potentially I say, not necessarily from day one, is that I would opt for slightly lower rep ranges. So I might progress someone through starting at, say, 12 to 15 repetitions. I might progress them to 10 to 12 repetitions. I might progress them to 8 to 10, 4 to 6. Over time, I might use different rep ranges. There's one tactic that may be to say, well, if you're working in an 8 to 10 rep range, and then I force you to go and try 4 to 6 rep range, immediately you've got to put weight on the bar. So immediately you are assuming that you've got form and all those sorts of good stuff's already in check and you can track muscles and all that sort of good shit. Assuming that's in place, I'm challenging you to lift more weight, to give you something new to think about. So broadly speaking, I would say work in multiple different rep ranges. I generally have, say this like 4 to 15 rep range when I'm working with various different clients. And then I kind of select, depending on the exercise, depending on the person, and depending how I want to progress them, progressions between those. So like I said, it might be 4 to 6, it might be 6 to 8, 8 to 10, etc., etc. And I might cycle through those particular rep ranges just to keep interest as one thing. Adherence to a program is a very valid thing and a valid tool, but also understanding that challenging, trying to get that person to lift potentially a little bit more weight are also good things. Now, as well, compound movements, multi-joint movements might lend themselves better to slightly lower rep ranges. And then you've got isolation movements might lend themselves to more higher rep ranges. But again, no hard and fast rules. You really got to find out what's right for you. So let's move on to the second question, which was all about how do you avoid muscle loss in a calorie deficit? So we've talked already this week actually about the fact that you can build muscle in a calorie deficit, but how do you avoid muscle loss in a calorie deficit? Now, the most important thing is resistance training. If you are not creating stimulus for your muscles to be used, then your body sees this as like a really expensive, fucking energy expensive thing to have lying around. We don't want all this fucking muscle tissue while I'm busy fucking starving myself. I mean, let's get rid of some of this shit because we don't need it. You're not using it, so let's fucking get rid of it. So if you're not resistance training, then your potential for muscle loss is going to increase. It's this kind of really energy expensive tissue that your body could really do without. So I would definitely keep resistance training when you're in a calorie deficit. Now, the key thing here is that how much really depends on the person. If you are new to weight training, that sort of thing, then you could probably push yourself quite hard in sense of you're going to build muscle in a calorie deficit. So why not take advantage of that? Why not aim for progressive overload? Why not try and just push yourself in the gym as much as possible and then try to eke out as much progress as you possibly can? Now, if building muscle in a calorie deficit is highly unlikely for you, maybe you're quite advanced or something like that, then it might be an opportunity in a deficit to really reduce volume and intensity. Now, people might throw up their hands and say, whoa, fucking can't reduce intensity while you're in a calorie deficit, or, can't do that. Why should I do that? And blah, 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 and chat loads of shit. Now, I'm not saying it's like the whole 12 to 15 reps for muscle loss and all that sort of shit that you hear. What I'm saying is that if it's very unlikely that you're going to build muscle in a calorie deficit, then don't make that your goal. Why not just come back down to what's the amount of sets that I need to do per muscle group in order to maintain the muscle that I have. That would give you the opportunity to potentially reduce a lot of fatigue that you might have accumulated over the course of a muscle building phase. So you come back to the gym much more refreshed. You're maintaining your muscle, so you're not necessarily losing any. You're not necessarily losing any strength. You're just managing set volume and you're managing your fatigue so that you have this nice break from lifting heavy weights and joints hurting and all that sort of shit. And then you can actually potentially make more progress in the future. Now, by also saying that you're reducing volume and things, I'm not saying you don't work hard. Maybe it is just a case you just reduce the amount of sets that you're doing. So, for example, if you were doing 4 sets, why not just do 2? Those 2 can be quite tough all-out sets if you want them to be, but overall accumulation of volume is actually much more significantly less, let's put it that way, than when you were in that muscle building phase. So yes, resistance training is absolutely important. Now, some people, when I put out this question, said it was specific amounts of protein, like it has to be above 1.8 or it has to be above 1.4, etc., etc., etc. Now, in reality, is that proteins are also an important part of the equation. Not the most important part of the equation, but an important part nonetheless. Now, in reality, when you look at the research, it really is around about 1 to 1.2 grams per kilo is where you can still maintain your gains, basically. So it's quite a small amount of protein versus what you might have perceived it to be in your head. Now, the caveat on that is that if you're already very, very lean, so if you're shredded and you're already at fucking Shredsville, then probably it's not going to be the ideal scenario for you. Bump up the protein would be the way to go. But most people probably aren't at that situation where you're not already specifically very, very lean. Therefore, you have a lot more leeway when it comes to your protein intake. Now, obviously, there are other advantages to why you might want to keep your protein intake high. So it has a higher thermic effect. So, for example, you're potentially going to burn more calories by consuming a slightly higher protein diet. It's going to help you feel fuller for longer. So in a calorie deficit, that's going to have its advantages. But if we're just specifically talking about muscle loss, you really don't need as much as you might think, unless you are in that situation whereby you are already freaking shredded. And then I think if you're already freaking shredded, you probably know what's what when it comes to protein intake. Now, the final question I put out there was, what weighs more? This is a bit of a fun question. What weighs more, muscle or fat? And pretty much everybody said muscle. Everyone said muscle. Now, this one is always a bit of a weird one because I always think that, basically that it's the fucking same. They weigh the same. If I put a kilo of muscle on the table and a kilo of fat on the table, they weigh the same. They weigh a fucking kilo. It's like saying which weighs more, a ton of coal or a ton of feathers. Now, just because you have this perception that feathers are light and airy and stuff like that, there's still a ton of them versus a ton of coal. It's also like saying that what's longer, a mile of motorway or a mile of footpath? Well, they're both a fucking mile, but different things happen on them. Now, the key thing is to remember is that it's not necessarily which one weighs more, it's just that muscle takes up less surface area. So again, like using the coal and feathers, a ton of coal is going to be a smaller thing than a ton of feathers. A ton of feathers is going to have to be freaking massive. And it's the same with muscle and fat. So fat is going to take up a huge surface area compared to muscle. That's the difference. One doesn't necessarily weigh more than the other. A kilo is a kilo is a kilo, regardless of what actually it is that you're measuring. It's just one takes up more surface area than the other. So hopefully that answered quite a few little niggling things about muscle and building muscle for you, and hopefully you got some nice little nuggets of information out of this particular episode.